Hi everyone, Dr. Lewis here. I hope that you're having a great day or night whenever you happen to be listening to this lecture. This is the first of our audio lectures that we'll be having throughout the semester. And this one is really set up at the beginning here to help clarify the theme as well as clarify expectations for how we're going to be applying the theme throughout the entire course to both our readings and papers. So our theme is sustainability, and I'm sure that you've used the word sustain before, and I'm sure, or even sustainable. But it's always good to kind of go back and look at the actual definition so we can kind of begin developing that as we move forward in the course. So the definition of sustainability, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is the quality of being sustainable by argument, the capacity to be upheld or defended as valid, correct, or true. And you always have to love when they use the word in the definition that they're trying to define. So, but basically trying to maintain or uphold an argument, and if you can, then it is valid or true. The second one is the quality of being maintained at a certain rate or level, which I believe is probably how most of us use the word sustain. Then number 3 is the property of being environmentally sustainable, the degree to which a process or enterprise is able to be maintained or continued while avoiding the long-term depletion of natural resources. So this is probably the topic of sustainability that you are the most familiar with. So in being environmentally sustainable, that is very close to environmentalism. You probably did Earth Day in elementary school. The discussion going on right now, like we're using resources too quickly, that we're depleting them. This is actually my first entryway into sustainability as well. It's kind of the idea of equating it with environmentalism. However, for this course, we'll be shifting the focus and using some of those same ideas, but applying them to other areas of life other than the environment. So we'll be looking more at definitions 1 and 2. So there are 4 types of sustainability. And again, that first one is probably one that you're familiar with. There's environmental sustainability, which is protection of natural capital, including natural resources such as air, water, and ecosystems. Then the second one is economic sustainability. And that one is consumption should only occur at the rate that you can be as well off after a period of time as you initially began. Material, labor, and energy must be renewable. So you can think about this one on a grand scale. So you can think about the American economy, which is a very complex subject matter. But how much money do we have? How much are we making? How much are we spending or should we be spending? As well as the materials, labor, and energy that go into both that consumption and that creation. You can also think about this on a more individual level. So think about how you make money or get money. And that'll be different for all of us. So some of you work, some of you have student loans, some of you have family members who are helping. However you live right now. And what this one will say is you shouldn't spend more money than you have before you get more money. So like, let's say you get a paycheck every 2 weeks. Your 2-week paycheck, you should not spend more than that in that 2-week period. And if you are, then it's not a sustainable situation. So that sounds very simple when you put it that way, but we all know it's a little bit more complicated than that when you're actually living life. But that's what economic sustainability really deals with. Then there's human sustainability, which is maximizing life experience, including a focus on lifespans, but also subjects such as education. So this is, how do we maximize the lifespan and be as happy as possible within that lifespan? And this is somewhat just health. So how do we have a healthy population or a healthy individual human being to live as long as possible with as high a standard of living as possible? But there's really other things that go into it as well. So it's not just good health that makes someone happy or fulfilled. So it's also looking at that other stuff that help really to really help have a fulfilling life experience. So subjects such as education, that there's a certain level of education and knowledge that helps somebody have a more fulfilling long-term lifespan. Also looks into stuff like values and community. So that's human lifespan or human sustainability. Social sustainability is going to be the focus of our class though, so it gets its own slides. So social sustainability is the focus. However, I don't want you to think of these as concepts that are separate from one another and that you can't use together at any point. That they are all interrelated. That you can't really have social sustainability without human or economic sustainability at the same time. So they are interrelated. But we're just going to be focusing slightly more on this particular aspect of sustainability. So social sustainability is maintaining social balance, that there are investments and services that create a basic framework for society, that community cohesion is created for mutual benefit, and this idea of connectedness between groups of people, tolerance, compassion, equal rights, patience, access to information, common standards of behavior, discipline, and ethics. So this is kind of the basics of what one would talk about when speaking about social sustainability. We're going to break it up a little bit further though, because I know that this is a lot of words on one slide. So thinking about the idea that we have commonly shared rules, laws, and information that promote social sustainability. This is typically agreed upon within a community, and that community, again, you can think big to small. Big America, like the entire country, but you can also think like a homeowners association, an HOA. So that might be a community just within one neighborhood. But this idea that there are shared rules and laws that really help promote social cohesion. And, just a good example of this is like murder. Typically, we all agree that murdering is bad and that it is against the law. So we agree that maybe we shouldn't murder each other, and that helps promote social sustainability between groups. And there's probably some people playing devil's advocate right now and saying, well, what about war? What about the death penalty? And we're actually going to talk about that later in the semester. So we'll talk about exceptions to commonly held rules. But in general, we have rules or standards of behavior that we agree maintain community cohesion, that helps us live together. So violence or revolution are the cost or result of failure to invest in the social health of our society. So if we don't have a healthy society, if there's something not working, if maybe we don't have a set of rules that works, or maybe we're not adapting in the right way, that's when we'll have violence or revolution. So you can think about that all the way back to like thinking about the Civil War. So the Civil War is an example of violence that came about as a result of having ills in the society that are not sustainable. So it's not a sustainable society long term. So, and I do want to emphasize that violence and revolution aren't always bad or good. So those can be terms that are positive or negative. So you could say that the civil rights movement falls into this category of revolution. but that had a positive effect. You could look through history and find ones that have negative effects as well. So by, again, that's a sign that something has gone wrong, and that the people want to change what has gone wrong. That there's been a failure to address social health in a way that has led to violence or revolution. And you could probably think of some examples of even right now that might be signs of bad social health, depending, on the situation. So basically, what social sustainability forces us to think about is that we all exist in this world and cannot, at this moment, pretend that we aren't connected to one another. So we tend to think about ourselves as individuals. I am going to college. I am working a job. I am going to have a family someday. And then maybe once you're, I'm not saying that everybody only thinks about themselves. Obviously, when you do have a family, or if you do have a family, you think about yourself as connected to them. But sometimes we don't think about the ways in which we are very, very connected to one another and really rely on one another, that you're kind of connected in ways that you don't think about. So unless every person listening right now kind of grows their own food in a little garden outside the back of their house, and maybe makes their own clothing from, I'm not even sure, maybe you need sheep for that. Like however you make your own clothing by yourself with no help, you're connected to people even in what, like if you buy something from China, we're connected to China, even though we don't think about that connection. So really, really thinking about all the ways that we are connected to one another, whether it's through products, whether it's through you have to go to a grocery store and buy fruits that maybe were grown really far away, hundreds of miles away from where you are. Thinking about the employees that help you buy those fruits. So really, really thinking about how we are connected to one another and thinking about ourselves as part of a system rather than an individual or just an individual. Not saying you can't think about yourself at all. So how do we relate to one another in a way that maintains social health and the greatest happiness possible? How do we negotiate our way in an interconnected world? So, and I think that this is becoming increasingly important, especially as we think about the kind of political situation of the world, thinking about a global economy. So it's hard to pretend that we're not interconnected. And how do we relate to one another? Again, maximizing the greatest happiness and the greatest potential for our lifespan in our societies. So theoretically, if we start at the beginning, this idea of a socially healthy world begins with the individual. So, and I know I was just talking about systems, but we're all kind of parts of that system. So a healthy individual promotes a healthy community, which promotes a healthy country, which promotes a healthy world. So healthy parts lead to the healthy whole. So basically investing in yourself or investing in citizens in a country to have a healthy, educated result. So there's a couple of terms that I want you to be familiar with, and most of these are at least touched upon in the reading that we had, the first reading that we had in Module 1. So this is a little bit of a review. So terms, the totality, or culture is the totality of that group's thoughts, experiences, patterns of behavior, and its concepts, values, and assumptions about life that guide behavior. So culture is one of those words that we use in some ways to refer to everything, but people disagree about exactly what it is or how to define it. So I think that this is a good definition that is pulled from our reading. So the idea that there is a group that has certain thoughts and experiences and patterns that develop over time and generations. And you can see that through values and assumptions about life, as well as other issues, other kind of signs of what our culture is. So it's easy just to use America, though we won't be focusing on America for the entire class. So thinking about this idea of symbols, rituals, values, and heroes that show American culture. So symbols, thinking about symbols, think about the American flag. Think about the bald eagle. So those are symbols that mean something to us, that they have meaning, that they represent what America stands for, or what we want to stand for. And it's the same for every country. So like everybody has a flag, everybody has symbols that they help to, or that they use to become signs of culture for them. So this idea of rituals can really mean anything. So the idea of a ritual, we kind of go to some really basic ones, like think about when you go to church, or if you go to church, that there will be certain rituals associated with that. When you graduate college, if you walk, there will be a ritual associated with that. When you get to wear your hat and shake someone's hand and get a diploma, that's a ritual. It can also mean more abstract concepts that we may not always think of as being a ritual. So going to a football game can be seen as a ritual. Singing the national anthem can be seen as a ritual. So it's basically a repeated behavior that has value for at least some community. Okay, then there's the idea of values. And values is one of those words that is a complex one, because cultures usually do have a loose set of values that help define that culture. That's also always in flux, though. So that's something that changes, and it's also something that people often disagree with, even within the same culture. However, there usually are a certain set of values that tend to at least loosely hold together a group. So if we're thinking about America, we could go to freedom, love of freedom, that's something that we value as Americans. And again, all of this is very complex, and we will explore it and tease it out more throughout the semester. But again, just thinking of the value as that kind of loose belief system that holds us together. And then the idea of heroes, which heroes is one of those surprisingly complex words. And if you think about who do I think is a hero right now, and I think a lot of you may answer parents, maybe teachers that were really influential to you, soldiers, firefighters, it might even be like a more personal hero. Some people might say, I had one student who argued that her hero was Beyonce. So it can be various people that become your hero, that for some reason you look up to them. Thinking about cultural heroes is a little bit more complex, because you have to come up with a hero that is everyone's hero in the country, or at least a lot of people's hero in the country. So we can still, some people would argue or say that soldiers still counts, or firefighters, or even teachers. You can also say that, like, Captain America is a fictionalized version of a cultural hero. So there's no right answers for that one. So people would argue different heroes depending on their perspective. But those are some of the responses that are typical and, again, would be seen as cultural heroes. And then a couple of other words that I'll go through pretty quickly, again, because we've already had a reading that briefly went over these. The idea of a subculture is a culture within another culture, that it's a smaller but still cohesive culture within that dominant culture. So if we're using America as our example, a subculture might be an Italian American. Subculture might be a specific denomination of religion within the greater culture. So, and when I say greater, I don't mean better. I just mean, think of it again as like parts of a whole, that we're going small to big. So subculture is very, very similar to an actual culture, but maybe a slightly smaller group, and also usually something that's a part of a bigger culture. So the way that a subgroup is different is that the subgroup is usually seen as a temporary involvement. So this is perhaps not something that is fundamentally a part of who you are, so much as that you're temporarily in the group and then at some point you could quit. So, and there is some ambiguity between these two terms, or some blurred lines. So for example, if I quit teaching tomorrow, which I'm not going to do, but if I did, and I took up another job and never thought about teaching again, then teaching would have been my subgroup for a while. So I had certain behaviors, a certain lifestyle, colleagues that would have been within that subgroup of teaching, but it's something that I can quit, more than necessarily being Italian American. So like, or it's not necessarily a part of who you are essentially. However, if I don't plan on quitting teaching and I end up teaching for the rest of my life and it becomes really a part of who I am, and then maybe I raise my kids with similar values and some of them go on to become teachers, then that is edging more towards subculture. Perhaps a better example would be, let's say some of you might be involved in a sorority or a fraternity, and for some of you that might be something that ends, as you leave college. So maybe that's something that you really participate in for a couple of years, and then life takes you in a different direction. So that's a subgroup. However, for some people, they actually stay in the sorority or fraternity. They start working for a national chapter, they stay a pretty active member, they stay with the same friends, they raise their kids in that kind of mentality, and maybe their kids get in the same sorority or fraternity. So that would be, and there's plenty of legacy families in sororities and fraternities. So that would be an example, again, of something that could be a subgroup that kind of becomes a subculture depending on who you are. Okay, so counterculture is similar to subculture, except the value system in the counterculture is working against the values in the subculture, or in the culture, excuse me. So it would be something that disagrees with the main culture that it is supposedly a part of, and maybe even at times tries to take it down or at least change it. So you can kind of think back to like the punk rock movement, where that becomes kind of a counterculture because it is a part of the greater culture, but doesn't always want to be, maybe criticizes the greater culture. Some people also bring up the hippie movement of the 60s or other times, obviously, but that hippie movement is another one considered a counterculture because it's part of a greater whole, but it has significantly different values and possibly even actively dislikes the values of the bigger culture. Okay, so 2 more words and then we can move on. So this idea of the word deviant, this one is, I want to make sure that you don't think of it in a negative term. So we tend to think of deviant as a bad thing. Like that's what we call criminals. That's what we call, that person is deviant. It usually means something bad. But deviant just means differing from the norm. So in this definition, as our reading stated, the deviant is a vegetarian is just as deviant as a murderer, because it just means differing from norms. So, but I mean, it undeniably has a negative connotation with that word, so just kind of keep that in mind as we use it. And then this idea of othering. What othering is when we define people when we define ourselves by what other groups are not. And that was a little bit confusing, actually. So think about it when there's a dominant culture and then we kind of point our fingers at another culture that isn't quite like us, and we define ourselves by what they lack and also say that we're better. So you can think about this in a good clear example of this is when we first started colonizing, and I'm going very old school for this. I'm thinking in British Empire and Spain and Portugal and colonizing. When they would go to South America or other countries and look around, the culture would be very different in a lot of ways. And it wasn't so much like, look at that other culture, oh, what might they, it's just as good as ours. It was like, look how different they are, and let's imprison them. Or they're savages, or they're not as good as our European standard. So that's an example of othering, though it can happen, again, think about all these terms, you can think of them on a grand scale and you can think of them on a small scale. So this can even happen in a classroom. There might be one person who is othered within a classroom. And I won't bring up any more possibly traumatizing elementary school memories. So moving on. This is related to the idea, and by this I mean social sustainability, of multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is maintaining a diverse set of cultures and religions within the same unified space. So America is defined as a multicultural space. A cultural contact zone is the area where two or more cultures intermingle. And what happens when two or more cultures intermingle with one another, that come in contact? And there are various results that can happen. Sometimes one culture can take over the other culture, sometimes very little happens, but typically what happens when you have a cultural contact zone is, if you can imagine two objects hitting each other, and then when they break apart, there's a little bit of the other object, if you analyze them very closely, took samples, there's a little bit of each object that rubbed off on the other one. So think about that being similar to cultures, that when two cultures come into contact with one another, once they come in contact, neither culture is quote unquote pure anymore. That we rub off on each other, that we adapt, that we necessarily kind of learn from each other, and that, that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending historically what time period we're looking at. So thinking about when European settlers came to early America, that they very quickly kind of adapted with Native American populations. So they start planting differently, they start living differently, and it's little at first and gets, greater as time goes on. But that even though typically it's seen as the European culture is seen as the winner in that situation, and imagine quote fingers around winner, but it's still an exchange. It's still rubbing off on one another. Okay, so thinking about what are the thought processes that can help us get to a more sustainable life. So, sustainable thought processes typically involve thinking in 5 ways that may be different than we usually do. So, a shift from short term to long term goals. So, if you have $50 extra this week, should you go spend it or should you put it in a savings account? And maybe in 30 years you'll have more money than that $50. So thinking about, and it's hard sometimes to think long term as opposed to short term. So moving away from the idea that cash profit is the only aspect that matters to a more balance sheet tally of success. So thinking about, we tend to think in terms of money. So is a business successful? We would think about how much profit did they make this quarter as opposed to last quarter. And this thought process tries to make us look a little bit bigger. So what are other tallies of success? Like if you made profit but used child slave labor in another country, does that make you less successful as a business? And there will be people within this class or otherwise who will disagree on answering that question. So, but just keep in mind that a sustainable thought process would look at more than just kind of the dollar amount. Thinking about everything as connected rather than focusing on a specific issue or just yourself as an individual. Start seeing the world as a system or a set of interrelated parts where nothing grows forever and nothing lasts forever. That's a cheery thing to think about, actually. So, interconnectedness of how we live with every other system in the world. Okay, so why is there a penguin picture here? I always love flipping to this slide. So this little thing is an adorable little blue fairy penguin, and that is actually its name. It is a fairy penguin. So the reason why I have this fairy penguin here is just to give an example of what I mean by thinking about sustainability. So we have this adorable little penguin, and a woman named Val Plumwood was vacationing in Tasmania, and she would walk on the beach every morning. And while she was walking on the beach, she would see these little penguins dead. So she'd find their little corpses along the beach, and obviously this was upsetting, partially because they're extremely adorable. Like, they're adorable little animals. If you look on Google image search, you'll find some of them in sweaters, so that might be something that you do later. So she sees these fairy penguins, and then everybody's telling her, oh, it's dog attacks. It's little things like dog attacks. And so she's like, well, okay, maybe there are a lot of dogs, and my dogs would love to chase a little baby penguin like this. But one day, one of them actually floats up to her while she's in the water, and it is dead. And she looks at it, and she's like, this wasn't a dog attack. So she starts asking questions. And this takes a long time. Like, asking questions leads to the black hole of trying to get through to government departments, as well as research that takes her outside of Tasmania, outside of Australia, all the way to Africa, and even up into areas near Sweden and Norway. So what she finds out is that there was a trade embargo on a certain type of salmon. And this trade embargo was lifted at a certain point. And when this trade embargo is lifted, Australian fishermen start using that salmon that they didn't have access to before. In doing this, it actually ended up upsetting the fish population of that area. And what happens is a triggered effect that actually destroys the food that the fairy penguin eats. So think about, this goes from a woman holding a dead little penguin on the beach to something that took her years, and looking at many different countries, trade embargoes, the politics and economics behind trade embargoes, and what happens, all the little ripple effects that happen when changes like that occur. So that's kind of what I want us to think about. Think about the fairy penguin. Think about how changes that you don't think will affect long-term changes. Think about how they can have a ripple effect. And we're kind of getting to the butterfly wing starting a hurricane metaphor here. But just keeping that in mind, that things are rarely simple, that changes that seem pretty straightforward can actually lead to that ripple effect. And I'm not trying to make a value judgment here, because there's probably positive effects of that salmon trade embargo being lifted as well. But there's probably no one who thought of all of the possible consequences. And update, just because I've been talking about dead cute animals for the last 5 to 10 minutes or so, they actually did end up helping the fairy penguins, and they're okay now. Their population is booming. They're not starving to death by droves anymore. So happy ending there. Okay, so this is also about thinking about shifting mental patterns. So thinking about making people feel guilty about recycling does not necessarily make large-scale changes needed to create a sustainable living situation. So think about how much recycling has been pushed on us and how many people actively recycle. And I'll give you a hint, it's actually not that many. I mean, comparatively, it's not that many. So thinking about, not that it's wrong to think about recycling, but how can we think bigger? How can we address the problem in a more nuanced or widespread way, rather than telling elementary school students to recycle? Likewise, even applying this to other areas, that throwing in a token person with a handicap into a TV show is not necessarily completely solving the issue of equality of visibility of individuals with a handicap. This doesn't mean that it's not helping at all. It's just we need to think bigger, think more complex. How do you think more long-term? How do we try to get to thinking about all of the consequences and not just immediate consequences? Some other questions that we will explore throughout this semester. What does it mean to live in a global world, a diverse world? What does it mean to see everything and everyone as connected, and as everyone possibly having consequences and benefits? Why is it important to have different types of people represented in media, or is it? How do concepts of gender, race, class, and others like religion affect how we see the world and are seen by the world? How does the individual relate to others? Should we be concerned about events happening in other states, other countries? What should be our involvement in other countries? And of course, these are big questions that even if we explored them all semester, we probably won't come up with a definitive correct answer, nor do I think that there should be a correct answer. It's more that I want us to start thinking about it. So what should our involvement be with other countries? How much should it concern us? Should we be concerned about what's happening in a state other than the one that we currently live in? Should Georgia care about what's happening in California, Colorado, North Carolina? How do the different aspects of our identity both define how we see the world and how the world sees us? And that can be gender, class, race, religion. It can be the country that you live in. So really thinking about this idea of sustainability is kind of a holistic way of looking at the world. How do we look at the world as connected? How do we relate to that connected world? Okay, so we're at the end of this audio lecture, and I am sure that some of you are happy because, again, this is going to be the longest lecture. Not all of them will be this long. But it's important to kind of establish the theme and really get us thinking about it. So this is the end of the first audio lecture. I want you to continue thinking about these themes. I want you to continue thinking about how they might apply to you as we move forward and start getting into some of our readings and the first paper unit. If you have any questions, let me know. You can go to the virtual lounge or send me a D2L message. I hope you have a good day, and until next time.